congressman, a member of the parish, was supposed to act as MC, but congressmen get busy, and so he didn't show up, at least at the beginning, and so the rector filled in time by making a few impromptu comments. And he said, to tell you the truth, when I first arrived here at St. Swithin's, I was not terribly impressed with you. In fact, the very first confession I heard told me about fraud, extortion, infidelity, and tax evasion. I was later very pleased to discover that this wasn't the norm at St. Swithin's. And about then, the congressman arrived, full of apology. He took the podium. He said, I will never forget the first day our priest arrived. In fact, I had the honor of being his first confession. In Lent, confessions are heard. One of my early mentors, Bishop Corrigan, used to hear the confessions of nuns at St. Mary's Anglican convent in Santa Barbara. And one day he got back to All Saints by the Sea after spending a morning with the nuns, and he said, you know, George, listening to nuns confess is a little like being stoned to death with popcorn. But should you need to stone me with popcorn, just make an appointment. It is Lent. So today Moses is leading his flock around. He's trying to find some good grazed land when he notices an amazing thing, a burning bush that is not consumed. Moses could have kept on herding those sheep forward looking for grazed land, but he says instead, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, a burning bush that is not consumed. And Moses turns aside and he approaches the bush. And it is only then, when the bush has Moses' full attention, that God speaks to Moses from out of the blaze. And he speaks to Moses of the deep suffering of the people in Egypt, a place Moses was acquainted with. As we walk through our own pilgrim path in the course of life, often we are in pursuit of good grazing land, of happy vales and good times. And sometimes we find ourselves in the wilderness. And if we are alert, we may notice a strange fire. And if we turn aside and attend, God may speak to us about the suffering of others. The suffering is addressed also in our gospel lesson today. It might have been a CNN reporter who came to Jesus and asked Jesus about the cyclone in Mozambique, or the flooding in Nebraska, or the massacre of the 2 mosques in Christchurch. This reporter asks about the slaughter of the innocent Galileans and about those killed by a falling tower in Siloam. And the CNN reporter wants to know, what is the explanation for these things? But Jesus is not on that day interested in serving as God's defense attorney. So he answers pragmatically. Tragedy, he says, reminds us to align with the work of God in this moment, as though this were your last moment, because some moment in the future will be your last. You've maybe read the book by Rabbi Kushner, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He was a little kinder in that book than Jesus seems today. Jesus seems curt by comparison. You're like a fig tree in a garden, and good fruit is expected of you, and now is the productive moment, and Father George is allowed to spread manure around you for another year to see how you turn out. When I was back in the United States, not all that long ago, I was still watching TV, and one night I I had the 11 o'clock news on, and I was pretty horrified to see a report about 37-year-old Jeff Bush, who had been watching television at 11 o'clock in his bedroom outside of Tampa, Florida, when a sinkhole opened under his house, swallowing him and the contents of his bedroom, while his brother watched helplessly from the next room. Since I was watching television at 11 o'clock, I went to the refrigerator and got a glass of milk. But I found myself thinking that sometimes I feel like Jeff Bush's brother. I see terrible and inexplicable and undeserved things happening in the lives of others, and I feel useless. Suffering, our own suffering, and the suffering of the world, or the suffering of those near at hand, is a kind of burning bush. And we can put on our blinders, walk on by, and find some good grazeland, or we can turn aside and attend. And if we do that, something will be asked of us. Come no closer, says God to Moses from the burning bush. You are on holy ground. To witness the suffering of others is terrain both holy and dangerous. We are not meant to enter entirely into their suffering, enter into the bush where we will be consumed, but we are meant to attend and to hear what might be asked of us. You can continue on looking for green pasture. You can rush in and self-immolate. Neither of those is really the right way to respond. To respond to suffering is to insist on having yourself a useful and fruitful life, and to listen for what that might mean in the lives of other people. So Moses heard the summons, but he didn't try and go it alone. He had Aaron at his right hand, he had Miriam at his back. Support grew, God was with him. Against all odds, the oppressors were subverted. So I would suggest to you today that the church does not have a social policy. It does, however, attend with a desire to be fruitful. At best, the church subverts pietism, which is the tendency to think that inward experience and a personal relationship with God is all that matters. And at its best, the church also subverts activism, the tendency to imagine one's own particular conclusions about the governance of the body politic align perfectly with God's. The pietist neglects the humanization of the social structures determining how real people live out difficult lives. And the activist equates a particular vision of social change with the will of God. And holy ground is much more difficult than that to navigate. So Moses knows now that God has a claim on his energies, but he'd like to have a bit more certainty about what this is all about and the one who is summoning him. And so he says, what name do you have? Under what banner shall I march? Are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Are you a member of the Green Party? And God answers, Yeh, Asher, Yeh. I am who I am. Or as the Jewish theologian Martin Buber renders the phrase, God says, I will be there as the one who will be there. And that's the only answer Moses gets. And it's not quite what he wanted. There is no satisfying answer when the towers of our lives fall. The towers at Siloam, the towers in New York, when Nebraska and Mozambique flood, or when houses of worship are terrorized. A Mexican professor down in Mexico City assured me on Tuesday that the CIA was responsible for the destruction of the World Trade Towers. And I said something that might approximate, come no closer. Don't try to name what you don't understand. That's just immolation in the fire of suffering. So when illness comes to another, or when marriages fall apart, or when a sinkhole opens up under our brother's bedroom, there is no answer, except to understand that God will be there as the one who will be there through that which is unnavigable. Attend the fiery bush and see if you can hear what might be asked of you in the hopeless moment. But don't imagine that you will have an answer for the CNN reporter who wants to know why. So St. Paul says to us today in a passage often taken out of context and often misapplied, no testing has overtaken you that is not common to everybody else, and that's probably true. But then in the misapplied section, Paul says, God will not let you be tested beyond your strength. He's trying to be reassuring, but let me tell you that for certain, I have seen people in circumstances that pass the limits of the endurable. And I have heard this passage used as an indictment of those who just quite can't stand up and dust themselves off quickly enough. I think Paul meant to be reassuring. This is a passage that is often misapplied. So Moses has one more question for God. How do I really know you're going to be with me? You ever had that question? And whenever we look into our symbols, we kind of like to ask that. And God says to Moses, here's the sign that I'll give you. After you have liberated the people, you and the people will worship me together on the holy mountain. Now that's a lot of comfort, isn't it? What a strange promise. Trust comes through exercising trust, and the result of trust is common prayer, which is what Christ summons us to today. Last week we heard that Christ is like a tender, brooding hen who would gather us to herself. Today, Christ is in a horse mood. He is sharp. The suffering of others demands something of us. We can gaze on by for good grazing land, or we can turn aside and attend to holy ground. That doesn't mean that God doesn't want to bind up our wounds and carry our burdens. But you can't talk about everything in the same Sunday sermon. And today, Christ tells us to step up to the plate and to pick up the bat, even if it's not baseball season, and even if circumstances are confusing. Avoid the easy answers and the quick labels when there are no good answers. But understand that, like the fig tree, something is required of you. So turn aside to the suffering that never seems to burn itself out and attend. Don't let the suffering consume you. Know when to stop your approach. You can't solve all the world's problems. Yet know also that injustice lays claim to your faith, and faith forges resolve, and resolve mitigates oppression. And once we have done what I am who I am has called us to do, then we will know that God is with us, because we will worship the God who will be there as one who will be there. Amen.